Discover the Justice League with Lee Button. I'm Laurel Westendorf. I'm part of the programming team at the Deschutes Public Library. Every month we explore a theme in our programming, and this month's theme is justice. You can find more free library programming in our printed event guide. It's available at all library branches and online at our calendar at deschuteslibrary.org/calendar. If you have questions in the audience, you can put them in chat or Q&A, and we'll definitely have time for a Q&A at the end. Our presenter is Lee A. Button, Collection Development Librarian at Deschutes Public Library. Before coming to DPL, Lee held a variety of library positions, most recently at the University of Washington's Tateuchi East Asia Library. Thank you so much, Lee, for walking us through this legendary team.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Hello, all. Welcome to Discover the Justice League. As you just heard, my name is Lee, and I'm a Collection Development Librarian at Deschutes Public Library. Comics and graphic novels are a huge passion of mine. I'm especially interested in superhero stories, so I'm very excited to be sharing that with all of you today. Here's a brief overview of today's talk. First, I wanted to do a quick icebreaker activity just so we can all get to know one another a little bit better. Then I'll be explaining what the Justice League is and why you should care about them, followed by a brief overview of the Justice League's history. Then, for those of you who are just starting out on your Justice League journey, I'll be providing an overview of how to read comics, which I know can be a major stumbling block for a lot of folks. I'll conclude by giving you my top 7 recommendations if you want to find out more about the Justice League. Throughout, I'll be peppering in some trivia questions. If, when I get to those, you all want to drop your answers in the chat, that would be awesome. All right, without further ado, let's do this. The Justice League of America, often abbreviated JLA, is a team of superheroes that appear in comic books published by DC Comics, one of the big 2 of comics, along with Marvel Comics. The team lineup has changed significantly over its 60-year history, but the founding members are among the most well-known. Almost always present on the team are a group of characters known as the DC Trinity: Superman, aka Kansas farm boy Clark Kent, Batman, aka billionaire playboy Bruce Wayne, and Wonder Woman, aka Diana, Princess of the Amazons. Arguably some of the most recognized characters in all of fiction, the DC Trinity are a great encapsulation of what the Justice League is all about. Larger-than-life figures doing battle in the name of what's right. The other founding members of the Justice League are perhaps not as well known as the DC Trinity, but absolutely worth exploring in their own right. They are Green Lantern, a space cop whose magic ring allows him to create energy constructs in any shape he can imagine. The Flash, who gained the ability to travel at superhuman speeds after a lab accident. Aquaman, the king of Atlantis who has sea strength and limbs and the power to communicate with fish. And Martian Manhunter, a psychic shapeshifter from the planet Mars. From their satellite base, known as the Watchtower, the Justice League guards the Earth, protecting its inhabitants from natural disasters, alien threats, and the perils of day-to-day life. Though they started out in comic books, the Justice League has since appeared in movies, video games, and TV shows. All right, it's time for our first trivia question. Woo! Most people know that Superman is faster than a speeding bullet, more powerful than a locomotive, and able to leap tall buildings in a single bound. But these are far from being the limits of his powers. Which of these is not a superhuman ability that Superman has demonstrated? A, producing a tiny version of himself, B, super burger eating, C, super dancing, or D, super ventriloquism? I will give you all a second to drop your guesses in the chat. I see a guess for super dancing, a guess for producing a tiny version of himself from his, someone is hoping that it's D. Okay, well, this is actually a trick question. Superman has demonstrated all of these powers over the years. I see another guess for A in the chat. If there's one takeaway I'd like you all to leave today's talk with, is that comics are weird. Even at the peak of their popularity, comics were seen as disposable, and the people making them were usually working under tight deadlines with limited oversight, meaning that the first idea that popped into the creator's head was often what wound up on the page. As a result, comics often reflect both the peccadillos of their creators and the attitudes, fears, and beliefs of the era in which they were made in an immediate and unvarnished way. Because superhero comics, like those featuring the Justice League, are about the clash between good and evil, they show in a sort of elemental way how ideas of right and wrong have changed over time. On the flip side, if you just enjoy wacky antics and explosions, superhero comics absolutely have you covered there as well. I'm now going to go through a brief history of the Justice League. The first Justice League adventure took place in the year 1960 in issue 28 of a comic called The Brave and the Bold, which was written by Gardner Fox and with art by Mike Sekowsky. It showed the League facing off against Starro, an alien starfish which had the ability to take over the minds of unsuspecting bystanders by infecting them with a miniature version of itself. In fact, many of the Justice League's early adventures saw them facing off against grotesque alien invaders, often wielding some form of mind control powers. These included Despero, the magenta-skinned warlord with 3 eyes, the intergalactic slaver Kanjar Ro, and the Alienator, a being from the future which sought to transform all human beings into aliens. To my earlier point about how comics reflect the time in which they're made, it isn't hard to draw a line between mounting Cold War paranoia and the idea that the defenders of America would have to overcome foes that had unearthly appearances, some of them literally pinkos, and who seemed to exert an uncanny influence on those around them. All right, next trivia question. Which of the following is not true about the creator of Wonder Woman? A, he was a polygamist. B, he was a classics professor and mythology expert. C, he helped to invent the lie detector. Or D, he believed that peace was only possible if men surrendered to the dominant willpower of women. Anyone have any guesses on this one? A guess for D? A guess is C, the lie detector is not true. Any other guesses? The correct answer, weirdly, is B. He was not a classics professor, but he was a total freak. William Moulton Marston, who created the character of Wonder Woman, also developed the DISC system of personality typology, which is used as a communication tool by many workplaces today. The years between 1956 and 1970 are often referred to by comic book fans as the Silver Age of comic books. This is because during this time, comics saw a second peak in popularity following the first boom that started in 1938, the so-called Golden Age of comic books. Silver Age comics are known for their less than serious tone, inclusion of sci-fi elements, and general disconnect from anything happening in the real world. Many of these stories are a ton of fun. I mean, look how much Wonder Woman seems to be enjoying pushing that dinosaur around. But there was a desire to grapple with more serious subject matter in a more grounded way. Historically, comic book writers had been prevented from tackling more serious topics by something called the Comics Code Authority. Prompted by a moral panic surrounding comic books, the Comics Code Authority was established in 1954 to monitor content in comic books in order to ensure that children wouldn't be exposed to anything that was deemed inappropriate for them. This inappropriate content ran the gamut from sex perversion, that is to say, depictions of any gender presentation or sexual orientation that fell outside of the cisgender heterosexual norm, to horror monsters like zombies and werewolves. The ban on werewolves, as an interesting aside, became an obstacle for comics writer Marv Wolfman, who received a citation from the Comics Code Authority just because his name was Wolfman. While the Comics Code Authority held major influence over the comics industry throughout the 50s and the 60s, by the end of the Silver Age, their power had waned significantly. Unlike the goofy and over-the-top Silver Age, the Bronze Age of comic books, which is the era between 1970 and 1985, was characterized by stories set in the real world and which tackled real issues. Well, I say the real world locations. There's still aliens and superpowers. One of the best-known Bronze Age stories, entitled Snowbirds Don't Fly, showed the superhero Green Arrow dealing with the fact that his sidekick Speedy had become addicted to heroin. Spurred on by these more serious stories, Jerry Conway and Chuck Patton, the creative team behind the Justice League at the time, wanted to bring the team further into the real world. 1984 saw the relocation of the Justice League to a new base in Detroit. It also saw an almost complete turnover of the team. Gone were Superman and Wonder Woman, who it was feared felt outdated and too unrealistic to be of interest to youth at the time. In their place came a selection of new members, including Vibe, a Latino breakdancer with sonic powers, Vixen, an African model with the power to imitate the abilities of any animal, and Cynthia Reynolds, a Roma girl with the power to become invisible. Not only was this league based in a real-world location, its membership better reflected real-world racial and ethnic diversity. All right, next trivia question. Introduced in the late 1980s, the DC super team, the New Guardians, fought a number of, let's call them questionable foes. Which of these is not real? So 2 of these are real and 1 of them isn't. Is it A, the Hemogoblin, an HIV-positive vampire, B, Nuclear Nancy, a survivor of the Chernobyl disaster, or C, Snowflame, a villain who gained superpowers from doing cocaine? Anybody think they can guess this one? I see a guess for C, it's a Snowflame. I see a guess for B, Nuclear Nancy. Any other guesses? The correct answer was B. Both the Hemogoblin and Snowflame are real comics characters. The Bronze Age impulse to tackle real-world issues wasn't always handled with the most tact or care. Another interesting fact about the New Guardians, it was the first comic book from DC Comics to feature an openly gay superhero in the form of El Extraño, a flamboyant Peruvian spellcaster. If only it hadn't also been the book with the AIDS vampire. At this point, the Justice League had been around for more than 20 years, and folks who had grown up reading these stories were now of an age that they were starting to write comics themselves. In the early days of the League, it wasn't unusual at all for stories to straight up contradict one another or to introduce elements which would be completely ignored by later issues. It was decided that the DC Universe would start over from the ground up so that stories going forward wouldn't have to be consistent with multiple decades of stories that had come before. To kick off this new era, DC put out a storyline that's one of the best known in the company's history, The Crisis on Infinite Earths. Created by Marv Wolfman, who I mentioned a little bit ago, and George Perez, 1985's Crisis on Infinite Earths told the story of the villainous Anti-Monitor, a cosmic being determined to erase all of existence. Although the Justice League was able to stop the Anti-Monitor from achieving his evil intent, a result was that many events from the history of the DC Universe were now out of continuity, meaning that for purposes of stories going forward, those earlier events had never happened. This had a twofold effect. On the one hand, it told what I think is an awesome story, which had extremely high stakes. On the other, it wiped the slate clean for writers and readers. No longer restrained by what had been written before, creators were now able to come up with their own takes on these characters that better reflected what was in vogue at the time. At the core of Crisis on Infinite Earths was the idea of the multiverse. Before Crisis, there were 52 parallel Earths that coexisted, each with their own history, characters, and conflicts. Through the events of the Crisis, the Anti-Monitor destroyed all but one Earth, leaving its inhabitants with no memory of the multiverse that came before. In the mid-1980s, America was also struggling with whether it was possible for multiple realities to coexist. Heightened global awareness and increased visibility of marginalized identities butted up against Reaganist ideals of traditionalism and authoritarian populism, buoyed by a sudden mainstreaming of evangelical Christianity. I am, to be clear, in no way claiming that The Crisis on Infinite Earths was written as a metaphor for Ronald Reagan's America. In fact, I would wager that the creator's only goal was to tell a story that was exciting and set the stage for further adventures. However, I do think it's really interesting to see how, in both big and small ways, superhero comics continue to reflect the time in which they are made. All right, here comes another trivia question. One of the Green Lantern's most menacing foes is which of the following? A circus clown, B, an evil snowman, C, a vacuum cleaner, or D, an ordinary house cat? I hope I've shown you all that comics are weird enough that any one of these could be true, but only one of them is. I see a guess for B, evil snowman. Any other guesses? Which of these is A? I see a guess for A, a circus clown. Well, the correct answer is D. After receiving a red lantern ring, the house cat Dexter became a recurring foe for Green Lantern, empowered by an elemental force of pure rage. Comics keep on being real weird. After the Crisis on Infinite Earths, the creative team of Keith Giffen and J.M. DeMatteis took over the Justice League and changed the name of the book from Justice League of America to Justice League International in 1987. This is often held up as one of the best eras of the Justice League. It shifted focus onto the interpersonal relationships between the characters, giving the book an almost workplace comedy feeling. One member of the team introduced during this time that really speaks to the book's ethos is Booster Gold, a time-traveling huckster from the future who became a superhero only because he thought he could make money by selling merchandise of himself. Speaking of selling out, with the success of Justice League International, it was inevitable that there would be an effort to build on it. This came in the form of a failed TV pilot that was later released as a TV movie. 1997's Justice League of America is a strange artifact. The effects are hokey, the costumes do not look good, and the dialogue is, let's call it, questionable. If you're at all interested, there are many clips of this film online. I can't in good conscience recommend the film in its entirety unless you're very much in the mood for some late 90s cheese. However, not all attempts at adapting the Justice League were as corny as the failed pilot. Following the success of Batman the Animated Series, animator Bruce Timm oversaw the creation of a Justice League cartoon in 2001, as well as its spin-off/follow-up, Justice League Unlimited, in 2004. Even if you don't normally watch cartoons, I would recommend giving the pilot episode of this show a watch, as it presents one of the best encapsulations of these characters since their introduction. The animated series swapped out founding member Aquaman for the alien warrior Hawkgirl. As a brief aside, Hawkgirl and her partner Hawkman are two of the most confusing characters to ever come out of comics. They have been angels, they have been aliens, they have been gods, they have been reincarnations of themselves. Honestly, the less said about the two of them, the better, just my opinion. All right, this is the second to last trivia question. Hope that y'all have enjoyed them so far. In Justice League Unlimited, the sorceress Morgan Le Fay attempted to defeat the Justice League by turning them into which of the following? A, animals, B, children, C, gold, or D, stone? I see a guess for C, gold. Another guess for C, makes sense. I see a guess for D. Another guess for C, y'all really think gold. The correct answer is B, children. I think that little baby Batman is particularly adorable myself. Although the Crisis on Infinite Earths cleared the stage for stories not bound by continuity, several decades on, writers again found themselves struggling to tell stories in the comics that were approachable for new readers. One example of this, at this point, 6 different characters had held the mantle of Robin, and even hardcore readers sometimes struggled to tell them all apart. It was decided that it was again time to reset the DC universe and to erase all of the stories that had come before from its fictional history. This was done in an event called the New 52. Overseen by the creative team of Jeff Johns and Jim Lee, 2011's The New 52 saw the cancellation of all books being published at that time by DC, and the launch of 52 new series, each starting over with issue number 1. Among these was a Justice League series that maintained classic members like Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman, but also added the character of Cyborg. Cyborg, aka Vic Stone, was an ordinary kid until he suffered a terrible accident, at which point his father, a super intelligent scientist, repaired his body using advanced robotics. Interestingly, Cyborg first appeared in a comic called Teen Titans, which was written by our good friend Marv Wolfman, one of the architects of the previous efforts, Crisis on Infinite Earths, to reboot the DC universe. The New 52 as an initiative was met with a mixed response, with some readers unhappy with the changes that had been made. The New 52 version of the Justice League formed the basis for the live-action Justice League movie, which was released in 2017. This film had a famously troubled production history, with original director Zack Snyder leaving the project midway through due to a family tragedy. This led to a 2021 re-release of the movie known as the Snyder Cut, which had 122 minutes of additional footage added in. There is a long and complicated story behind the release of the Snyder Cut. I will not be going into it here, but if you're in the mood to find out about some truly wild internet behavior, lots of folks have written about it at length. Just Google Snyder Cut and prepare to be horrified/amazed. Also during this time period, a series of animated films were released, which adapted a number of Justice League stories. I'll be touching more on that in just a second. So what's next? At the end of this most recent January, it was announced that DC would be starting their cinematic universe over with new films and TV shows. Although nothing concrete has been confirmed, it's a near certainty that the Justice League will be appearing in these in some form or another, which, in my opinion, is all the more reason to dive into them now. Why not be the person in your friend group who, when a new superhero movie is announced, gets to say, oh, I've read the story that's based on. Of course, new comic stories are coming out all the time as well. I'll be telling you all a little bit more about that in just a second. All right, we've got the last trivia question. Which of these is not a real DC Comics character? A, Dumb Bunny. B, Crazy Shy Lolita Canary. C, Captain Carrot. Or D, Arm Fall Off Boy. Any guesses? I see a guess for B, a Crazy Shy Lolita Canary. A guess for A, Dumb Bunny. Any other guesses from anybody? Yeah, they're all pretty wild. A guess for Captain Carrot? Yeah, that one sounds pretty improbable. Well, this was another trick question. All 4 of them are real. Those were all the trivia questions. Hope that you all enjoyed them. Something I get asked a fair amount. How does one read comic books? Not in the sense of like understanding words and pictures on a page in front of you, but more in the sense of how to get your hands on comic stories in order to read them. If you've ever wondered this, stay tuned. Though you can seek out comic stories in individual issues, this is pretty costly and usually requires that you go to a specialty comic book shop. Instead, I'd recommend you either look for trade paperbacks or hardcover collected editions, as these are often available in regular bookstores and usually collect entire stories, not just pieces of them, meaning that they're a better value overall. So, where can you find trade paperbacks or collected editions? I may be just a little bit biased, but I think that the best place to start if you want to read comics is your local library. Nearly all libraries have a graphic novel section, most of which contain some Justice League stories. If you're a DPL customer, we actually shelve all of our Justice League comics together under the call number Justice League in our Teens graphic novel section. If you use a library system other than DPL, try searching in the library's catalog or asking a staff person for assistance. Another great option available to DPL cardholders is HOOPLA. HOOPLA is an online service through which library customers can instantly check out ebooks, e-audiobooks, movies, music, and digital comic books. Just go to the HOOPLA homepage on your web-capable device and search Justice League. If you aren't a DPL cardholder, see if you can get access to HOOPLA through your local library. So now that we've gone over the history of the Justice League and how you can get started reading comic stories, I wanted to quickly go over my top 7 Justice League stories. These are either series or standalone volumes I'd encourage anyone to check out, and which I think give a really good feel for who the Justice League are and what they do. My first recommendation, and honestly, if you're just going to pick up one, it should be this one, is DC, The New Frontier, written and illustrated by Darwin Cook. New Frontier reimagines the formation of the Justice League, but brings a more modern sensibility to the story without losing the giddy sense of fun or sweeping scope of adventure that made the source material so enjoyable. It also draws out some of the parallels to historical events that I've alluded to, making them a little clearer and putting a slightly different spin on them. DC The New Frontier was adapted into an animated film of the same name that's also totally worth checking out. If you want a straight-ahead story of heroism and adventure, New Frontier is the book/movie for you. My next recommendation is perhaps a little odd, as it doesn't actually feature the Justice League at all. New Superman, written by Jin-Lun Yang and with art by Victor Bogdanovich, Richard Friend, Brent Peoples, and Joe Lalich, shows what happens when the People's Republic of China tries to create a Justice League of its own. It centers on Kong Keenan, a meathead bully who undergoes an experimental procedure that gives him all of the powers of Superman. It also features Chinese versions of Batman, Wonder Woman, and The Flash, as well as the Dragon Son, a North Korean version of Aquaman. It's really cool seeing familiar characters and motifs transposed to a completely different environment, especially with characters as iconic as the members of the Justice League. Pick this one up if you're feeling daunted by the prospect of a team with 60 years of history under its belt, but still want a taste of high-flying adventure. One of the most creative Justice League stories that I've ever read, DC 1,000,000 imagines what the DC universe would be like in the 853rd century, or roughly when the 1,000,000th monthly issue of Action Comics, the first comic to feature Superman, would be published. In addition to being an interesting thought experiment, 1,000,000 is also an analysis about what makes each member of the Justice League linger in the public imagination, and how those iconic images might shift over the course of many, many, many years. Seek this one out if you're a sci-fi fan, if you gravitate towards concepts that make you go, huh, never thought of that before, or if you enjoy stories that are based on a what if. Another off-the-beaten-path recommendation, DC Comics Bombshells was actually inspired by a series of figurines that reimagined DC Comics characters as World War II-era pinups. From its inauspicious origins, you might expect Bombshells to be something kind of cheesecakey and shallow, but Bombshells, which was written by Marguerite Bennett and with art by Marguerite Sauvage, is actually a surprisingly tense thriller that juxtaposes the bright and bombastic optimism of superhero comics with the grim realities of wartime. If you're a historical fiction reader, or if you draw inspiration from stories of courageous people facing impossible odds, I definitely recommend seeking this one out. Whether or not this counts as a Justice League story is sort of a philosophical question. Do 2 League members a league make? I'm not sure. But either way, The Hikatea, written by Greg Rucka and with art by J.G. Jones, explores what happens when 2 heroes fall on either side of an issue due to a difference in their respective moral codes. After committing what she believes to be a justified murder, a woman seeks sanctuary at the Amazonian embassy, which puts Wonder Woman, Princess of the Amazons, into conflict with Batman, who was hunting the murderer down. This standalone story is great for readers who enjoy dicey moral conundrums and those who are interested in the intersection of identity, morality, and the law. Something that I personally think makes the difference between a good superhero story and a bad one is whether the protagonists are actually heroic. Do they save people? Can they put aside their differences for the greater good? If you feel similarly, then The Final Night is the story for you. Written by Carl Kessel and with art by Stuart Immonen, Mike McCone, and Darryl Banks, The Final Night imagines a nightmarish scenario. Earth's sun has gone cold due to alien interference. Rather than focusing on the Justice League, slugging it out with the alien perpetrator, Final Night focuses on their efforts to deliver aid to the people of Earth as a seemingly endless winter settles over the globe. If the hero part of superhero is really what speaks to you, I'd urge you to seek out this story. Now, the Justice League is really an embodiment of the spirit of teamwork. Heroes from different backgrounds coming together to stand up to common foes. This is thrown into sharp relief by Tower of Babel. Oops. Okay. Tower of Babel, a Justice League storyline written by Mark Waid and with art by Howard Porter. Batman, never fully trusting those around him, develops contingency plans for how to take down each of his fellow Leaguers should they someday go rogue. However, his paranoia backfires when his plans are stolen, and suddenly a mysterious enemy with knowledge of each League member's weaknesses starts coming after the team. If you enjoy Machiavellian machinations and a plot that's full of twists and turns, this is the Justice League story for you. So those are my top 7 Justice League stories. But before I wrap up, I wanted to give 2 additional recommendations. Because of their prominence in culture, the Justice League has inspired a number of imitators, copycats, and otherwise been reinterpreted in an unofficial capacity by a number of creators. I wanted to shout out 2 stories. While they don't actually feature the real Justice League, provide what I think are really interesting riffs on the team's core concept. Astro City is a comic series written by Kurt Busiek, which sets out with an interesting aim to create a fictional universe with a history as complex and convoluted as the DC universe, but all at one time, rather than piecemeal over the course of many years. The result is stories that have the same depth and vibrancy as superhero comics from the big 2, but which are self-contained and just a little narrower in focus. Astro City's equivalent of the Justice League, the Honor Guard, doesn't feature super heavily in these stories, but as a result, when they do show up, it feels special and important, like, wow, the Honor Guard is here. My favorite Astro City story is entitled Tarnished Angels, and it depicts an investigation into a serial killer who is targeting former supervillains. Similar to Astro City, Black Hammer, written by Jeff Lemire and with art by Dean Ormston, tries to channel the excitement and absurdity of superhero comics into a more self-contained format. Once the protectors of Spiral City, a group of superheroes find themselves mysteriously transported to a small rural town that they are unable to leave, and in which no one seems to know who they are. Eerie, tense, and mysterious, Black Hammer is a great pick for readers who are interested in what happens when the idealism of superhero stories clashes with the mundane challenges of real life. There's actually a Justice League Black Hammer crossover comic as well. It's super fun, but probably not the best place to start if you're new to both teams. But once you've had the chance to familiarize yourself with the Justice League, it's, a great way to kind of see them operate in a different context. So I hope that at least some of those titles piqued your interest. If not, I've got my contact information on the last slide. Feel free to reach out to me directly and ask for more personalized recommendations. Or if you want to ask now, we can do it in the Q&A at the end. I wanted to conclude by saying again, comics are weird. They are deeply weird, but they're also full of unbridled imagination and exceptional artistry. By envisioning a world in which the Justice League defends the planet and its inhabitants, the many creators who have worked on these stories over the years have given ordinary people something to aspire to be, and prompted readers of all ages to consider what heroism means to them. They've also created a fascinating historical record that offers a really unique perspective on the last 60 years. Here's my contact information. Thank you all for going on this journey with me today. And if anyone has any questions, I would be happy to take those now.